Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Frontline Club. It's a pleasure to have Kathy Eldon here this evening. And I'm going to hand you over to John Owen, who is the chairman of the club and also a professor of journalism at City University. He's going to chair tonight's discussion. But before I do that, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So over to John.
Thank you, Millicent. First of all, welcome to you all. I'm glad you've turned out in such good numbers for tonight, because we have a really special guest in Kathy Eldon. I recall the first time I ever became aware of Kathy Eldon. I was sitting in a dark edit suite with an editor who had edited lots of material from the Ethiopian famine, had seen many disturbing images, and also was rarely moved when he saw someone speaking. But we happened to see the video of Kathy Eldon speaking at the Journalist Memorial in Washington, D.C. This beautiful sculpture of glass and iron, and they were etching the name of Dan into that sculpture. And Kathy got up to speak. It was an oppressively hot day. She writes about it in her book. Hillary Clinton had been there and gone, and then Kathy got up. And she talked about the fact that Dan's death had not been in vain. And then she said this: "Let our souls all be reborn today, dedicated above all to the communication of inspiration and truth." And the way she said it had the entire crowd in tears. And Colin and I sat in that edit suite and wept. We were so moved after hearing what Kathy had said. That was my introduction to Kathy Eldon. From that time, struggling to come to terms with the death of Dan, but not to get closure. I heard someone start to use the word closure, and she said, "I hate that word, don't use that word." To today, as the founder and the inspirational head of the Creative Vision Foundation. She's a powerhouse, as described by Christiane Amanpour in a very nice blurb about the book. When people ask me about her, I say she's a force. I characterize her as a force. She's here tonight because she has published this wonderful memoir that I recommend to you, In the Heart of Life. And it's published 20 years from last July that Dan Eldon was murdered along with 3 other colleagues, 2 from Reuters and then Viz News, and another journalist from Associated Press. Actually, no one knows the story of what happened better than one of our guests in the audience tonight that I hope we hear from, Mark Wood, who was the chief executive then of Reuters and was a brilliant example of how a caring news executive responds to the death of a freelancer. Very important distinction, a freelancer. But Kathy's memoir, the book, is not just about trying to rebuild her life after her son's death. I just want to say that. This is a memoir about her own journey, her own coming of age, from her upbringing in the Middle America, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as Kathy Knapp. We know about Middle America, that's where I come from too. But it's about her journey and her life along the way in London, here in London, and then in Nairobi, and a lot happened in that life, and she candidly tells it all. It's a full and very frank description, and often X-rated. That'll should help the sales of the book.
Keep going. That's good.
It's about white mischief and all the life and times in Kenya. But that conversation is for another audience. We're here at the Frontline Club. Vaughn Smith created this place to honor journalists, especially freelance journalists, who have given their lives to pursuing the news. In the Frontline Club itself, as you go into the members' room, you see the pictures of his colleagues who have lost their life, and he lost a few, 8 colleagues along the way. Why this place matters is because the families and friends can come to this place and know that their lives were not in vain, that they are remembered and celebrated. And I just want to point out that with us tonight is the father of one of those freelancers who lost his life covering the war in Chechnya, a very unpopular war. Roddy Scott was killed when he was 31. And Robin, often with Stina, are here. Robin is here tonight with us. And what Robin and Stina did, like Kathy, is create a foundation in 2008 to try to do something to pay back to an area that's been terribly deprived. So they created an educational foundation working to educate the children of the Pankisi Gorge. And so it's been selfless work on their part, but an example of, again, sort of the community that exists here, well beyond just simply coming to talk about the news. One of the things that Kathy did after Dan's death, among many things, was to plunge in and decide to make a film about Dan's life, also to create a photographic exhibit. And I thought the way we can get into this tonight is to have Kathy read from the book what was in her mind when she set about trying to make this film, a huge task after Dan's death. And that will then lead us into showing you an excerpt of a powerful documentary called Dying to Tell the Story. So first of all, a very warm welcome for Kathy Eldon.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. I see so many familiar faces, some people I haven't seen in 20 years. John Davey once lived in my house in Nairobi and was making films then, extraordinary films. A family, Adrian House, who is the editor of this book, right there with the puppy on. I guess so grateful to have you here, Adrian. Mark Wood, thrilled to have you. And particularly, John, I have to say thank you to you. John has been really, after Mark started it all, John has been the person who's really taken the torch and really helped us get the word out, get the film out. He teaches the film, and to have him here today, he said he doesn't do this very often. He sort of, lets other people do it, and I'm really honored to have you speaking about this today. So thank you ever so much. So just a little bit of background. Right after Dan was killed, it was I don't know what day it was, but it was 7 in the morning. I got a call and was awakened by the news that my son had been killed in Somalia. And I remember just the horror, trying to tear down the curtains in the hotel where I was staying in Los Angeles. And then the sense that I had to do something, even within a couple of hours, because I was a filmmaker then, I was making a film, that I had to make a film about these incredible young people. I didn't know who all had been killed at that point, but as soon as I realized who had been killed and why they had been killed, and the absurdity of what had happened that triggered the crowd that killed the journalists, I knew I had to make a film. So I moved to Los Angeles, and immediately, with the help of Mark Wood and Reuters, and then Mark brought on the Associated Press, really did plunge into trying to understand why journalists do what they do and what it does to them. We did a number of seminars around the states, Columbia and Duke University. Yeah. We did an exhibition called Images of Conflict that traveled to many countries, was opened by a bunch of heads of state. It was amazing. Meanwhile, that was one part of the journey, but the other part was the grief. And I don't have to tell you all over there what that's like. And so many of you have gone through this with family members or with other journalists. This is a very precious place, obviously, for those of us who share this terrible club that many of us belong to. So the grief part of it was incredibly painful, and Amy and I did a book called Angel Catcher, A Journal of Loss and Remembrance, to try to get through that grieving process and share it with others. But we were having trouble. And one day, Amy called me. She'd transferred out of one college into another, and she was at Boston University. She said, Dan wanted to be a war correspondent. I want to be a peace correspondent. And she wanted to try to figure out projects that would bring people together, not tear them apart. And a project that she did for her senior year documentary film class was to try to understand why journalists do their job. And she got a B on it, which she was really annoyed. But that proposal, that treatment, made its way to the head of Turner Broadcasting at TBS, Pat Mitchell, who went on to become head of PBS in America. Pat read the proposal, called Amy and me in. We flew her in from Boston, and it was like we were pitching this thing. You don't have to pitch it. We want to make this film. So we were given one of the top directors ever. We were given a budget, a really colossal budget at that time, and we were told, go make the film. We went to 7 countries. We interviewed 7 frontline journalists, including Christian Amanpour, I'll say. And today I'm going to read you the little sort of build-up to the clip that we're going to play for you. So, okay, this is back in 1996. As we moved closer to our start date, I grew anxious. The shoot was going to be long and complex, with locations in England, Israel, and South Africa. And now that Dan's story was to be included, we would visit Nairobi and Mogadishu as well. These would be the two most ambitious and potentially dangerous sequences, especially if we were to film the Abdi Villa, where Dan and his colleagues had been killed. I had to evaluate the risks for our team very carefully, and I lay awake many nights worrying about my daughter, for she would be interviewing war-toughened correspondents and talking on camera at the site where Dan had been killed. I didn't want her to be overwhelmed by the experience, but she told me she could handle it. Like her brother before, she was on a mission and wouldn't be diverted. I need to see the place where Dan became a man, Amy said. We can't stop now. My principal concern was that Somalia was still a disaster zone, even more dangerous than it had been when Dan was killed. In 1993, the presence of UN peacekeeping forces in Somalia had meant there was some semblance of order. Now, with a devastated economy and no government, constitution, or police, the country was no more than a battleground fought over by rival warlords. One was General Mohammed Aideed's son, Hussein Mohammed Aideed, who controlled only one sector of southern Somalia, but whom the Somali National Alliance had declared president of the entire country. 2 others had divided the rest of Mogadishu between them. Hussein Aideed was the undisputed overlord of the area around the villa where Dan and his friends were killed. We would have to obtain his permission if we wanted to get in, film the interviews, and get out safely. To fly in without his okay would be beyond foolish. So we flew into Nairobi, and we flew into London initially, and Amy did her first interview, and this is particularly moving because downstairs there's a picture of this person. For her first interview, Amy had chosen Carlos Mavrilian. How many people knew Carlos? Did anybody here? Yeah, incredible human being. The freelance cameraman who had known Dan in Somalia. Carlos represented the Bang Bang school of reporters, an apparently reckless breed that faces death as coolly as if ice water ran in their veins. He talked about how hard it was to maintain a relationship while taking on dangerous assignments that put the, quote, utter evil and the supreme good side by side. After years of that life, he was planning to switch on to the safer career of filming documentaries. Regrettably, he would die before that happened, while pursuing a story about terrorist training camps run by someone few of us knew about then, a man named Osama bin Laden. Carlos's last words to Amy chilled me. Be bloody careful, he warned. Somalia is a nightmare. I was held up at gunpoint 3 times in one day on my last trip 3 weeks ago. Amy was most anxious about her second interview, which was with her greatest heroine, Christian Amanpour. Cool and often brusque on air, she was gentle with Amy, and her eyes glistened when she said that Dan had been doing exactly what he wanted to do, and that he had died for a purpose. Amy listened intently. I knew how much she wanted to believe it, but I could see she wasn't yet convinced. Amy's last 2 interviews in London were with veteran war photographer Don McCullen, who had clearly been traumatized by all that he had seen, and puckish BBC correspondent Martin Bell, famous for his spotless white suits. He showed Amy his matching white flak jacket and explained how embarrassed he'd been when he'd been felled by stray mortar shards while covering a story in Bosnia. He was upset that he was immediately evacuated and received excellent medical care in England, while locals, most wounded far more seriously, were lucky to receive any assistance at all. So right there, I've got one more little passage, but right there we've covered quite a number of people you have on your wall here. So I was, yeah. Okay, so we've arrived in Mogadishu, a very scary flight in, landing at the only place that was safe to land, which was 50 kilometers outside of Mogadishu. No, sorry, we haven't flown in, sorry. We're still in Nairobi, and I have to get permission to fly into Mogadishu, okay? So this is in Nairobi. not knowing whether we're going to be able to make it or not. And okay, early the next morning, I had to secure our authority to enter Somalia and confirm that Hussein Aideed was still willing to allow our interviewers in Mogadishu. The key to all this was in the hands of his so-called ambassador in Nairobi, whose headquarters were in a block of flats next to Chester House, which still housed the press center where I'd worked with Marianne Fitzgerald as a journalist. My stomach tensed as the taxi pulled up in front of the building, now dilapidated with paint peeling off its walls. I couldn't resist looking inside the press center, where I spotted the familiar bronze plaque engraved with the names of the journalists and companies who had offices there. The name Mohammed Amin leapt out at me, along with a host of memories. 3 years after Dan's death, Mo had been killed too. Standing in the aisle of a hijacked plane, negotiating with armed men, when the plane ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea, I recalled Mo's sparkling eyes and inquisitive spirit. My friend had been only 53 at his death, but it was, literally, 2 lifetimes since he let 7-year-old Dan peer through the lens of his camera. I recalled the phrase proudly displayed in his off, "I'll sleep when I'm dead," but I couldn't imagine that Mo's active soul or Dan's would ever rest. Next door, I took the decrepit elevator up to the ambassador's apartment on the 4th floor and made my way down a long corridor that smelled of rotting plants and cooked cabbage, clenching and unclenching my hands. What if the ambassador said no to our request? I would never find out what really happened to Dan. The man simply had to agree. Offering up a silent plea to whoever might be listening, I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. The meeting occurred. So, nevertheless, after a nail-biting day, we learned that Aideed had agreed we could come, provided we hire his security men, apparently a euphemism for a bunch of AK-47-bearing thugs. This meant another $2,000 in the budget, but there was no turning down the offer. So that night I lay awake for hours, full of doubts about my decision to fly to Mogadishu. So this is what really sets up where we are now, I believe.
And we will get this to a point where we hear the diary of Dan as Dan's foreboding about this trip, and then carry it on to the end with Amy's journey. So we'll look at this. It's about 10 minutes.
The voice of Dan is played by Christian Bale, by the way, before he was famous.
A man called Dabo Abuka was killed yesterday. 2 young boys died today. What sorrow. Every day on Radio Mogadishu, dozens of incidents like these can be heard. Sad, senseless deaths. In Somalia, the AK-47 has replaced the law. To arrive in Mogadishu for the first time is like falling into hell.
Finally, I will be able to see for myself this place that had such a hold on Dan. He was so well loved in Somalia that the people there called him the mayor of Mogadishu. He blossomed there, and yet it was that place that killed him. I feel anxious because I don't know what I will find on this journey, but I do know that I have to go there.
Yes.
What's his name?
His name is Mohammed. I know him.
Yeah. Sahafi. And Sahafi means journalist, right?
Yes.
So it used to be wall to wall with
We
journalists?
used to be here.
Yeah.
And that's a road going to the airport. And we were here. I was standing here, exactly here, right opposite that door. The house which was bombed is just behind those houses here. All of this area, it was full of helicopters, Cobras, Black Hawks, and firing from such a short range. They were right at the top of the rooftop of the houses, and they were killing anybody on the street.
Unfortunately, that was the day Dan was going to leave. And Hoss was sent in as his replacement. Dan was packed. And Hoss went to the journalist's hotel to meet Dan. They put their bags down there. And then there was the report of this house that had been attacked by American helicopter gunships. and reports that a lot of people were killed, and the Americans had clearly thought Mohammed Aideed, the warlord, was in the house, and it appeared that he hadn't been. And so a convoy of journalists decided to go up to the house to see really what had happened. And of course both Hoss and Dan went together. Dan didn't have to go, he could have gone down to the airport. But, you know, he worked very closely with Hoss, and as I said, he was very keen on the story, and he didn't want to miss a big story on his last day.
I'm the observer. What would happen if the observer got shot? It would be very bad. But if you take up the responsibility, you sometimes pay the price.
Because of the danger, they decided it would be better to go en masse in a convoy. And unfortunately, in a way, the Reuters car was one of the first cars in the convoy of 5.
The day was clear like and hot like today. Here is when Dan said, Babuji, are you afraid? And I said, yes, I am. I said, why do you ask? He said, yeah. Then he kept quiet for a second, and then I told him, I said, look, there's nothing to worry about, and but if I'm afraid too, but I think if I'm shot, I will be shot with an American bullet and not a Somali bullet. That really showed that there was something in us which was, we were a little bit frightened of. All this area was full of people, and as soon as we came out, I was here, and they said, journalists have come. Everybody got away. I, Dan, and Anthony, we all moved in. People were bringing out dead bodies from this house, and it was really shocking. I went in, I did a few 10-15 second shot of one dead person, and then there was another pickup, I did another one. The person who took the first turn out was somewhere about 10-15 feet where that small tree is, and he just picked up the stone from there and he hit the first stone. Dan was behind me. Dan said, Babuji, let's get out of here. I can still hear his voice up to today. And I said, fine. I took the camera off my shoulder and I said, run. They all ran. As soon as I was turned back, that's where I was thrown on the ground, pushed on the ground, and I was attacked by the mob.
The crowd turned hostile. Some of the other cars realized that and pulled out. And our car, the Reuters car, backed away. So when Dan came out, the Reuters vehicle was a lot further away than it had been when he'd been dropped there. And as he tried to get to the car, the crowd turned nasty.
The hardest situation to deal with is a frenzied mob, because they cannot be reasoned with. I try to appeal to one or two of the most sympathetic and restrained-looking people with the most effective-looking assault rifles. But I've realized that no photograph is worth my life or any other part of my body.
Mohammed Shafi was shot and severely beaten, but he managed to escape the mob. After he was finally taken to a hospital, he learned that he was the only survivor of the violence. Journalists Anthony Macharia, Hansi Kraus, Hoss Mina, and my brother were all stoned to death by a Somali mob on July 12, 1993.
I don't know why this all happened. It was waste of human lives. I feel really sorry and hurt for the Somali elders and children and women who were inside that house who got killed. That was the reason why the locals were so much hurt. And I don't blame them at all. But they were full of anger, not only on whites, on all journalists. Tali, I do blame the Americans what they did. But up to today, you won't believe the truth is I'm living with it. I can't forget it. The main reason for me to come here is because I can't forget what has happened. Maybe I'm alive today to tell you what has really happened. Maybe that was the reason God had wished.
Well, thank goodness you're here.
It has made me proud that my pictures or the pictures of my colleagues who have risked their lives and done this hard work, and it has saved lives. That's the main thing. I'm proud that my life has not been wasted of being a cameraman in Africa.
I have never been more proud of my big brother than I am today. And I think he may even be proud of me too.
Sad epilogue about Shafi. He never did recover, did he?
No, Shafi was a broken man. And earlier in the film, he said, you know, I've always felt badly. I had 4 children. He said, I've always felt badly because I've always been away. He said, but I'll have the rest of my life to make it up to my children. And he lived, I think, another year after this film was finished as a completely shell of himself. And he died of a massive heart attack while covering a story in Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's so painful to see him in that condition, even in this film. And here we are 20 years advanced, and Somalia is still a failed state. And the journalists that are dying are Somali journalists. They're local journalists because it's almost impossible to cover.
I think maybe last year did 17 or 18 die.
Well, it's depends on, again, how you're counting these. But yeah, they're local media workers, they're journalists who are fixers or interpreters working for local
brave.
papers.
Yeah, extraordinarily brave. Yeah.
After the film and after Images of Conflict, you also come and sit down. Yeah, anybody who's at the back, we still have
There are 3 places up here and 4
very
over
comfortable seats down here.
Right here.
Carol, come on down, have a seat.
There are 4 more places on the sofa. Come on. Quickly.
Hi, Angela.
3 more places on the sofa. 1 place over here. And deep. 1 more over here. 2 more places on the sofa. 1 place here and 1 place here. Come on. 1 over here. Roland, come down. 1 over here. I'm waiting for someone. Okay. There's a waste of 2 beautiful seats here.
After the film and after Images of Conflict, you also found all of Dan's diaries and journals and collages. And you've turned them into several books. One, The Journey is the Destination, and this more recently. Speak about that aspect of his life, because what he did in that time was so prescient of what we see now, and they live on so beautifully.
Well, I'd like to say that I think he was the sum total of every bit of inspiration that passed through our house and passed through Nairobi. I was a journalist. I was covering stories, features about the most incredible, creative, active, sort of non-conforming. Tiana Leakey's in the hall today. Her dad, Philip, and her mom, Valerie, were 2 of my great heroines in Nairobi. I got to write stories about people who were nation building. They were challenged by all the aspects that are, nothing had been done, basically. So they just rolled up sleeves and did it. So I got to tell stories Dan followed in my footsteps. I made him take pictures for me. We had people like Angela Fisher and Carol Beckwith who are here tonight, passing through our house, John Davy. We experienced the most magnificent people possible. So Dan took a little bit, everything rubbed off on him. So if a photographer would come through, he'd learn how to take photographs. If Angela and Carol would criticize his work, it was phenomenal, exciting. So out of that came this desire, I think, to capture what was going on. And I used to bring him black-bound journals from whatever the place is here that you could buy, empty journals. And he started filling them up. And remember, there were no computers really to speak of. There was no internet. There was no Facebook. I mean, what are you going to do with your life? There was no real television. So he did these journals late at night often. And they got more and more complex and more exciting. Peter Beard was a friend. So they became a representation of this inner life. He was pretty private about them. Amy would take them and show them to special guests like Angela and Carol. But when he was killed, we found them. I found 3 in California. I found a couple in my apartment in London. They were all over the place. And they burst forth with this life that we were very privileged to have Chronicle Books have a look at them. And the guy said, no, we're not going to publish these one journal. And I was devastated. He said, no, we're going to do 3. So that was the beginning. And the first one, The Journey as a Destination, is sold, 125,000 copies. It's studied in schools of journalism, photography, film. It's on coffee tables, and it's the basis for the film that we're actually doing now.
And did that lead you to this idea of conceiving the idea of the Creative Vision Foundation? How did that grow out of?
Yeah, I think that after Dan was killed, we did a whole lot of media stuff, but I really wanted to do something which could take that energy that we experienced in Kenya and communicate it, use it as a sort of spark to energize and catalyze action in other people, to ignite souls, And it wasn't such a grand ambition then, but we had a little bit of money that we could spend. And so we would give out grants. The first grant we gave was to Born Into Brothels, one of the first films that really had a social outcome or created a movement. And soon we realized that the benefit we could give that was better than just giving out little tiny bits of money was to create a structure that could support people who were trying to tell stories that needed to be told about problems that needed to be solved. So we created fiscal sponsorship. We've now created what we call an academy, an incubator, and an agency for creative activists, which most of you are, people who use media and the arts for social impact. We, over the last 10 years, have worked with 200 people, projects and productions. We right now have 100 projects currently that we're working with. And we are in Malibu, and you all have to come and visit. It's really beautiful. It's the most beautiful place on earth.
I think we're going to hold here and bring you all in because you obviously have some questions. I'm going to ask Kathy to read at least another passage from the book a little later, and perhaps the first person I'd like to bring in is Mark Wood, because again, this club stands for a commitment to freelancers. Dan was a paid freelancer in that he had a retainer, but thinking back to those terrible dark days and how you had to respond to all this, it must have been a very difficult thing for you.
Yes, we'd never experienced a tragedy on that scale at Reuters of having, in our case, 3 people killed in one incident. And I don't think, journalism has become a lot more dangerous since then. But of course we'd had people killed and injured in other incidents. 2 things which happened. One was we'd had a principle which we reinforced in this case, which you've referred to, which is if you're a freelancer, if you're working pretty well full-time for the organisation, you are part of the organisation. There was no discussion around, are you treated differently? Do we not care about this person? They weren't on the pay. No, it was total your family, if you like. And that was quite important. And it also, it became a point of principle for me as well, because I remember having blazing rows with a couple of other TB organisations which didn't behave in that way towards freelancers who were killed, covering dangerous stories. But the other thing which emerged from this incident was a rethinking about what do we do to prepare people for hazardous environments, for war coverage. And it led a lot of news organizations, ours among them, to start looking at hazardous environment training, preparing journalists much more. And thinking back, we'd actually not really thought about it before. And that became, and these days it's just part of the routine to have 2 or 3 days or even a week of hazardous environment training. Looking back, sadly, and that film says it, I'm not sure it would have made any difference in this case. This is one of these stories that turned so strangely and so suddenly that no amount of preparation would have really helped. But since then, and I know from personal experience, I was editor-in-chief at Reuters till 2000, and then I was in charge of ITN for a number of years. The number of journalists who've come back and said the training saved their lives, whether it was understanding even incoming and outgoing shells, actually, simple stuff like that, but also first aid stuff and so on, that actually the training which came from that date did start to prepare people better for war environments and dangerous assignments. And I think in that sense, that incident was a turning point. And we and Reuters and of course the AP who lost a guy, we worked very closely. And as Kathy knows, we then had events in London and in the US where we started to focus attention on the work of reporters and photographers on the front line.
Thank you very much, Mark. But, you know, and it's in the book, and Dan really knew Africa, so you and Mike Eldon were confident that he would be able to work in a difficult place because he knew the language, he knew the culture, he knew everything. Is that why you felt that even well beyond his years he could do this kind of work?
For sure. He'd been trained by the best. And he was streetwise, he was bushwise, he was Mogadishu-wise, which is even more challenging. He loved the Somalis. He loved their audacity and their, you know, the way they were. And I think he felt very comfortable there and very happy there. It did get really tough, and he had post-traumatic stress disorder for sure.
Already?
Oh, 100%. He'd seen, you know, hundreds of dying dead bodies. He'd witnessed people dying. He'd seen, he'd nearly been killed a number of times. So he was ready to leave. I mean, he was ready to go off, and he wanted to study film at UCLA, you know, I mean, he was ready. But it was not, no journalist had been killed, remember, too. So I didn't think he would be killed, but I was very concerned about him there towards the end, for sure.
And he wanted out. He wanted to get out. He knew it was time
done.
to get out.
Yeah.
Let's go to the floor, and again, sort of, if you can identify yourself if you're of an old friendship of Kathy's, but let's take your questions, please.
Hi, Kathy. Hi, John. Not an old friendship, but a new one, hopefully. I just wanted to add to what Mark said. Sebastian Junger recently, I think, opened the Risk. I don't know if you heard of it. The Risk Foundation, which is for more independent freelancers to sort of be in the field, you know, that are not joined up with AP or Reuters or people like that, to sort of get their training and combat experience. Just wanted to say that, and they're open to foundations as well.
They just did a 4-day course and was hosted by the Frontline Club. They just did it within the last month. Something like 20 freelancers from all over the world.
So good.
So you're right. That was in response to the death of Tim Hetherington, again, so associated with his club. And because the people who were around him, the freelancers in Libya, didn't know how to apply a simple tourniquet. So he bled to death without anybody knowing how to respond. Again, sort of why, as my students know already, first aid is such a vital part of training. Yes? We have no comments, no questions for...
They all want to go drink in the front line.
They want to go drink. Here's the back. I'm going to come back. We're going to get some more from Kathy if there's nobody.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. My name's Lois Austin. I'm not a journalist, but I am an aid worker, and I'm interested to hear what the motivation is from the kind of research that you've done and your understanding of what Dan was doing. What motivates journalists to go into war zones? I have an understanding from my own aid perspective, but I wonder if it's any different from a journalist's perspective.
We're surrounded by journalists. I feel like we should ask them. But I think from the perspective of what we learned in the film, it's certainly, there is a desire to break that story and tell stories that need to be told. And I think, Carlos Mavrolian we chose because it was the kind of bang bang, but the guy wanted to get the stories out, and he did his very best to, in whatever way possible, to get the story, because he thought it was important that we understand what's going on. And they don't just want you to understand, they want you to do something about it. I think that's my perspective, and you might have far more to say it because you meet so many.
Yeah, no, but I think I'd like to hear from other journalists if you want to add to what she just said. Vaughn, anything? Vaughn Smith standing at the back.
I would add to. I think there's there's a great desire to engage the world as well. I think it's about getting out there, understanding the world. I think there is a tendency for some people to find it a very exciting lifestyle. You're on the edge. You live a little bit more, it seems, when there's excitement around. I think all these things combine on a scale, but I do believe that there is very real sense of wanting to meet a sort of public need for good quality information, which underpins all this.
Vaughn is the person who's behind this club, by the way, just so you all know.
Others? Yes. Mike.
Kathy, yes. Your loss obviously is very important to you. A lot of young people that I've met, and John Davey and myself have been on those front lines before, and I've taught media sessions in this club with a lot of young people who want to join the industry and actually confront the problems. You've lost a son. Would you advocate anybody actually joining the industry, and why?
Really good question. I certainly am. I consider myself to be a journalist. What I find unnerving is the idea. People are very inspired by Dan, and they want to kind of go and be him. It's a different situation now, and the idea of a kid going off to cover Mogadishu or Syria without training, without risk, without really proper training is chilling. I don't like that idea. I do encourage the study of journalism. That's interesting too, because there aren't a lot of jobs in conventional journalism anymore. They're shutting down bureaus. So it's, last night I spoke at a journalism class, and it's like, okay, where are we going to put you all? And so it's looking at how you're going to tell stories differently, and then how you're going to tell them safely. But of course I would encourage people to be storytellers.
Well, Vaughn is in the middle of something called the Freelance Registry. It's breaking ground, and just a word about it, Vaughn, because it's critical to what Kathy's talking about and to Mike's question.
I think there's a problem with freelancing today. It's clearly become more and more important. The larger part of what we're getting out of Syria is coming from this sort of independent freelance community, despite the risks, as the news industry is perhaps compelled to withdraw. I think... sorry, I lost... What was the question again? Sorry. I'm just getting too... the freelance register... I was getting too into my own answers. The Frontline Freelance Register is a new initiative that launched in June, which tries to give a route for those freelancers who want to portray themselves and demonstrate that they're properly professional and prepared to meet the industry's safety standards, if we can establish what they really are. And so it's really a register of people who subscribe to the highest ethical and safety standards, and wish to separate themselves from those people who perhaps don't. And through it, so it's a sort of representative body for freelancers. We've got 400 people who are part of it at the moment. So it's turned into something with real potential. And there's nothing like it, nothing that has a sort of mandate to speak for the independent sector, the people who take these sort of risks in the news industry, to my knowledge, today. And so we're very hopeful that it can actually improve the welfare and thereby the effectiveness of these people.
Brilliant.
Two questions here.
I'm Nicholas Meller, aid worker. You mentioned Amy's reaction to this and saying, I'd like to be a peace journalist, but is that not a contradiction in terms? Where are the stories, and is there anything substantial that you could say about that in terms of her perspective that she's taking
Thank you.
compared to everyone
That's
else?
a lovely question. Basically, Amy became a writer and a documentary filmmaker. So in a funny sort of way, first of all, we did this film. And then we did a film about the children's peace movement in Colombia, which was looking at, we were flipping it. We wanted to do a story about children of war, and we knew nobody could bear watching it. So we actually did a story about children who were peacemakers. We went on to do a series for PBS called Global Tribe, which was people seeking solutions, really social entrepreneurs. We then did a film recently called Extraordinary Moms, and it's for Oprah Winfrey Network with Hillary Clinton, Julia Roberts, Rosie O'Donnell, and Christiane Amanpour, and the 3 extraordinary mothers, but looking at people, again, who are seeking solutions to challenges. So I think we are, and we're not Pollyanna at all, but we're really not ourselves about finding the challenges as much as finding the solutions. So I guess, that's maybe a way of finding peace, as it were, is to seek solutions. So we're not really journalists.
And the editor of your book, Adrian, congratulations.
I just talked to her. Thank you. Kathy, in your book, you write a bit about what persuaded you that you could do something to make very large what Dan in his lifetime had only to be able to start off very small. Could you tell us something about this jet power inside you which started to launch creative visions?
The jet power, oh gosh, I don't know where I'm supposed to go with that.
What personal experience persuaded you actually to go out into the world and do all these things when you've been perfectly happy working in Kenya?
All right, it's really Debbie's fault. All right, Debbie? Debbie, this is I wasn't going to go this way, but I'm going to tell you what happened. After Debbie's in the book as well. I mean, everybody's in the book who's here. It's amazing.
That's why they're quiet.
Yeah, they're very quiet. Yes, exactly. So Debbie worked very closely with camera picks during that time, and she knew Dan, and she knew the guys who were killed. But Debbie was pretty troubled by what had happened, but I believe you went to a psychic. Not because you were troubled by what had happened, but because I believe her love life was a bit of a disaster. Is that right? And my recollection is that she would need a little counseling, little advice as to what she should really be doing. And she had an experience, which is relayed in the book, so an extraordinary experience where the psychic, or the medium actually, didn't really want to talk about her love life. She said, look, my God, there's this something terrible happened, and there were 4 people were killed, and you were closest to the one with the elfin face, the charismatic one. He was a teacher, and he will teach many people in the future. But she described how these guys had been killed, and Debbie was so completely traumatized and excited, and both exhilarated and just shocked by what she heard, that she called me up and she said, Kathy, this happened to me. You may want to go and visit this woman. And it was like, Debbie, are you kidding? Like, you're crazy. But I was interested. I booked under a false name to see this woman named Molly Martin. And I went to visit Molly, who was a very sort of governess-like woman living in Chelsea. And I remember it very vividly. She had a white sofa and red roses, and I turned up, as Jane Smith or something, and sat down, and she started to tell me what had happened, this travesty. She said that there's been a travesty, and she described in vivid detail, actually, how Dan had been killed. She described the 2 memorial services we'd had. One had been in Nairobi with family and friends, and one had been an industry thing at St. Bride's. She went through a number of things, and she said to me, and it was not words I wanted to hear. She said, you're going to be speaking at high-profile events. You're going to be speaking to industry leaders. You're going to have to do a film. You're going to start a foundation in your son's name that will benefit children. You will be doing a collection of books. She couldn't really quite understand what I would be doing, but using his work. And finally, she said, and you're going to be doing a film. Finally, she said, you're going to write a book. And so that was the beginning of all of this stuff. And I have to say that, I'm not an advocate, I'm not an evangelist, but I think without that sense that I had that crazy spirit, that noisy spirit on my shoulder, I never could have done what we've done.
But you had other experiences as well.
Yes, absolutely I did. Another one with an incredible medium several months later here, Brenda Lawrence, who I just talked to today, and I talk to her once a year, but who, when I walked in with her and I'd booked under another name, she said, oh, my goodness me, I can't promise anything. But when I walked in, she said, oh, there's this gorgeous young man saying, Mom, I guess it must be your son. And she even described where the blow had been to Dan's head, which we didn't know yet because we hadn't received the death certificate, but it was totally confirmed by the death certificate. So it's been a very interesting adventure with, I hear Guy Fawkes Day is out happening, but thank you very much for turning up. But with this sense of being accompanied, and I feel it very strongly.
How do hard-headed journalists react when you tell them these stories? Spiritualism is not something that journalists deal easily with.
No, but you'd be surprised at how many hard-headed journalists have had transcendent experiences where they have felt something more than they can explain. I think we all have things that we, get shivers up our back, or we think, cheapers, surely that didn't happen. And I think if one is open and upfront about it, as a skeptical, cynical, straightforward journalist, we're amazed at how many people have, just stuff. Don't get it.
Oh, my students are sitting quietly. I'm surprised. There's
a noisy one. Good.
I'm Jade. I'm in John's class at City University studying journalism. And I met you at the Fourth Estate Leadership Summit in Los Angeles.
You're Jade, absolutely.
Yeah. I had a question. I've heard you describe Dan as a creative activist. And I know your organization talks about using the use of drama or arts or just some sort of creative activity to tell a story and be journalists. And so some of us in our classes, while we're pursuing journalism, have been told that journalists need to be objective and just tell a story. And sometimes there's a line there between telling a story and getting involved, and it's pretty easy to cross it. And so I'm interested in activist journalism, and I'm still exploring what that means. But if Dan were here today, his life seems to defy the idea that journalists can't be activists. So if he were here today, what advice do you think he would have for us?
I wish you could see the whole film, because in the film, Christian Amanpour is asked by Amy, I guess, is it possible to be objective? And she tells a story with Bill Clinton, I think, something where Christian had a point of view. It's not that journalists don't have a point of view, and I think what I'm working with is not specifically journalism, it's storytelling, and I think journalists have to try to be terribly objective, and so I don't know if I would say that we're trying to cultivate this use of the word creative activism in the same way with journalists. But Christian indicated that it's very difficult to be totally objective, and you can try.
Well, there's a debate raging right now, if you've been following the exchanges between the former executive editor of the New York Times, Bill Keller, and Glenn Greenwald, who has just left The Guardian to go to this new, huge venture about this exact issue, about where does impartiality stop and advocacy begin, and can you straddle both parts of this and be a responsible, rigorous journalist? So this is a huge issue right now that's breaking out right in front of us. So I don't think there is an easy answer to that.
Well, if Dan were here today, how do you think he would respond to us? And what advice would he give us as student journalists?
I think he would say, you have to tell the story, and you have to try to really figure out the objective way to tell the story. If you want to advocate, become a creative activist, then maybe do a documentary where you really have a chance to take a position and figure out what outcome you want, and then how you're going to help people advocate or donate or volunteer or whatever as a result. So I think there are two different ways to approach that. So I think that's what he'd say.
Well, in the book, too, you talk about the safaris, and that really planted the seeds of journalism. The activism preceded the journalism, didn't it?
For sure. Yeah, he was an active soul, and he took on first a child who needed a heart operation and raised money for her, took on a family that needed money and sold jewelry. He took on a community, a refugee camp, where they needed aid, and he enlisted the help of 15 of his friends and created student transport aid and led 15 kids across Africa, which was a transformative experience. Jeff Gettleman, who many of you know, who's the bureau chief for East Africa for the New York Times, was one of those kids. Christopher Nolan, who is the director of Batman, was one of those kids. Eleanor Tatum, who's now the publisher of the Amsterdam News, was one of those kids. So it was a transformative experience. But that was his, that's when he learned how to take action, for sure. But then as a photojournalist, he was showing what was happening, and he didn't like it. I mean, I don't think he was on the side of the warlords necessarily,
Well, he was just evolving into a professional photojournalist. I think he had not been that long working for Reuters, but it was his sensational pictures, wasn't it?
Actually, he was really among the very first to go into Somalia. He heard that there may be a famine in Baidoa in southern Somalia, and he and Aidan Hartley, who many of you probably know, Aidan was a 23-year-old Reuters correspondent, and Aidan and he flew up, and Dan's photographs, which he sold to Reuters for $50 each, and he was very proud of that, but hugely horrific photographs were among the very first that went out around the world through Reuters and really helped trigger the response that brought in all the Dan Rather and Diane Sawyer and all those folks, and then helped trigger the Operation Restore Hope. So that was a pretty big thing for Dan.
You talked about being in New York when suddenly you went to the newsstands, and what did you find?
Yeah, that was about a year later, July of 1993. I was in New York, and I just sort of happened by a newsstand and opened Time magazine. There was a center spread, Dan Eldon, of a burning tank and helicopters over it. And I thought, my God, he's so close. And then I opened Newsweek, and it was another photograph. And then we went through all the different newspapers of FT and the New York Times, and there were Dan's photographs. And that's when I realized that it was really, really dangerous.
But weren't you continuing to have this struggle, this battle between the creative person you are, who wanted him to go to the world, and the mother, who worried that something terrible was going to happen?
Absolutely. And I the night, let's see, it was my birthday, June 26th, and 19 Pakistani peacekeepers had been killed that week, I believe. And Dan, somehow we were able to talk. And I said, don't you think it's time to get out? And he said, Mom, please don't ask me to leave. And Jonathan Clayton, had said, please, would you just stay on one more time? We've got somebody coming up, but we need you a little bit longer. I didn't know this till later, but he said, Mom, the story continues. I have to stay. And I thought, my God, what do you do? Because I made some decisions in my life that were very tough for him to deal with. And he ultimately said, I think you were courageous. I don't like what you did, but you were courageous to do it. And that was my moment, honestly, to turn the tables. And I had to think about it. But I said, okay, Dan, I'm so proud of you. You're living the life of your choice, and I'm proud of you. And we agreed. He said, Mom, I love you so much. I'm sending you a ticket to Nairobi. And I said, no, I'm sending you a ticket to London. And we agreed we'd see each other in 2 weeks. So I was able to validate his decision, and I don't regret that. He was a grown-up man. He wasn't going to pack up and leave because I said, please leave. But I had the opportunity to have that conversation, which I think was, thank God I had it, is all I can say.
It kind of gets to something I thought I would ask you to read. I heard your interview with the BBC Outlook today, BBC World Service, and the interviewer asked you to talk about whether you had forgiven the Somalis for what happened. You told the story of what happened in Washington. Tell that story, and then I'd like you to read a passage, and I'll follow that up.
Yeah, thank you. I was angry, of course. We've all lost people and things and relationships, and we can be very angry. And we went into Somalia. When we went into Somalia to shoot Dying to Tell the Story, Somalis were so angry that we were there that after we came out of the house, and you saw it looked like a doll's house, you know, the entire front was gone. We came out of the house and we saw these people. They said, hurry, hurry. The cameraman said, hurry, get back to the car. And the Somali women primarily gathered around the car and started banging on the doors of the vehicle. And I don't know what they would have done had we remained. So I left Somalia, not that excited about, Somalis, I'll be honest. And I understood exactly why they'd done it, but I still couldn't feel comfortable. We finished the film, and incredibly, the premiere was at the United Nations. 750 people at the United Nations. So Amy and I got all dressed. We met Shafi. That was the most incredible experience, to meet Shafi in the lobby of the hotel. We climbed into a cab to get to the United Nations. And I looked at the cab driver, and I thought, oh my God, the guy was a Somali. Unbelievable. And I thought, what do I do? What do I do? And so I decided, of course, that I had to tell the guy what had happened. So I spoke to the back of his head, and I said, okay, my son, and I told in vivid detail what had happened, and I didn't know what his response was going to be. We got to the UN, and he turned around, and I could see there were tears in his eyes. And he said, my name is Mohammed, and I know everything about your son. He said, I lost a brother, a relative in that too. He said, your son and his friends, they were just trying to do something good. We know that. All of Somalia, all of Mogadishu, people were so upset by what had happened. I thought, oh God, what do I do? This is really hard. And he looked at me and he said, on behalf of all Somalis, I ask your forgiveness. And I thought, wow, and I remembered Dan's foster brother, Peter, had written me a letter right after Dan had been killed, and he said, Somalia is the world, is a metaphor for the world, essentially. Somalia needs redemption. And I thought what Gandhi said, if the world is to change, it is we who have to change. And so I said, I hate what the Somalis did, but I totally understand, and I absolutely forgiven the Somalis who killed my son. And with that, it was like a skylight opened in my head, and it really, I think, dispelled a lot of the darkness that had lingered there. And I must say that I feel that what I've been able to do over the last number of years has been made that much easier, because I'm not carrying around that anger, that sense of I didn't have a sense of revenge, but I believe that if we can stop the cycle of revenge, we do have a fighting chance for the future.
And that leads me actually to asking you to read a passage about not the forgiveness that you asked toward the Somalis, but your own long struggle to essentially forgive yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to read this passage. I think I've marked it from here, and it goes over. It's, you now are into therapy,
mm-hmm.
and you're coming to terms with that part of your own.
He didn't tell me what he was going to ask me to read. So this is a big
I found
one.
is one of the very moving
thank
passages.
You. Thank you.
I've marked it with the arrow.
Thank you. Wow. Okay, I'm going to do this. Okay. So in Kenya, there was one person who could be considered to be, as it were, a therapist, and she was a nun. No, this was a therapist in Los Angeles. Yeah, I did see a counselor in LA or in Nairobi, but this was a very sophisticated counselor therapist in Nairobi. Los Angeles. Sorry. Okay. Leaning towards me, my sophisticated therapist in her affluent Los Angeles home offered much the same advice the gentle nun had given me in a shabby Nairobi shopping center. Be peaceful, Kathy, she said. I could hear the echo of Sister Leonie's voice when she added, inside, you know all the answers. I nodded, knowing she was right, but was I courageous enough to go there? I wanted to bolt from the room when she said, close your eyes, just breathe. Subduing the urge to flee, I followed her instructions. As I breathed deeply, I acknowledged that in truth I did know the answer to her question, and had all along. It was guilt that kept me from feeling worthy of receiving the success and love I desired. My mind flashed back to my wild days in Africa. Although I tried to move on, I still felt ashamed about my past. There was something else, too, even more distressing. Despite my husband's protest to the contrary, I still felt in some way to blame for Dan's death. After all, I'd encouraged him to be a photojournalist, unwittingly launching him on a journey that had led to his murder on that dusty road in Mogadishu. I struggled to put into words the thoughts that had long been buried in the deepest recesses of my mind. Joanne sat without speaking until it was finally quiet. "Is that it?" she asked, sounding almost disappointed. "From the way you began to speak about yourself, I thought there was much more to come." I shook my head. "Now I have a few questions," she said, peering at me with her characteristic no-nonsense look. "You forgave the Somalis who killed your son." I nodded. It had taken a long time, but finally I'd gotten there. "You've forgiven Mike?" "Oh, yes, of course. And as he had said, if we'd both been able to do it over, we would have behaved differently. Has he forgiven you?" I nodded again, grateful that we were now good friends. "How about Jeremy?" she probed. "He did the best he could," I answered. "I would always love the tormented man who'd set me on my path of self-discovery." She stared into my eyes. "What about Dan?" I looked up, unsure what she meant. He hadn't tried to die. Then I realized how angry I'd been with him for leaving me. I still was. It was irrational, of course, but she was right. I had to forgive my child for dying. Eyes brimming, I nodded. "Now you have one more person to deal with," she said, tilting her head to one side as though coaching a very slow child. Again, at first I didn't comprehend what she meant. Then the understanding swept over me. "You have to say it, Kathy," Joanne pressed, folding her arms in front of her. "Tell me." It took a long time, but I finally managed to form the words she demanded to hear. "I forgive me." Later that night, it seemed like a skylight had opened onto my soul, dispelling the remaining pool of darkness within. Finally, I understood that every action, each deed, word, or choice not only affects us as individuals, but also has an impact on many others through the endless network of our relationships. Sometimes, to save ourselves, we make decisions that hurt those we love, praying that over time the wounds will heal and that we will be forgiven, and that we can forgive those who caused us pain. As a result, a heart may be broken many times before it cracks open enough for the spirit to free itself and finally become an active soul, what Emerson described as an unencumbered, unobstructed, active soul. With that revelation, I prayed that my soul could finally be free, unburdened of the guilt that had confined me for so long, ready, willing, and perhaps even to search out and find my mate. And I did.
Mike asked earlier about what you would say to those who aspire to do what Dan did. I just want to come back to that a bit because you have a lot of young aspiring journalists here. Do you still, though, feel that taking the risk, reasonable risk, to go tell the stories in the world is worth doing?
I think if you feel compelled to do that, that you have to be wise and responsible and then go and do it as well as you possibly can, you know? And no story is worth your life. And Mark Wood is the first person to tell you that. You do not risk your life for that story. It's not worth it.
But if their families were here, if their parents were here, their siblings were here, would you say the same thing to them?
I think you have to be true to yourself. I think you have to follow what is your purpose in life. And if you, for this period in your life, and I'm speaking to Jade right now, if you feel that that's what you need to do, I say you go and do it. You know, don't get killed, please, because that's not appropriate. We don't want anybody dying. But I think you have to. Yes.
Okay, it's me again.
Good.
Both of us, John and myself, have been in wars. We've seen it all. We know what the risks are, and we've survived. Look at that man over there. That photograph. Don McCullum. He's now 75. He's destroyed. He's seen it all, and he can't really talk about it. It's it's a success, but also of a failure of somebody who's been there and can't quite cope with it. Now, if your son was alive today, do you think he would want to go on with it and do something? Or would he actually sort of, at some point, say, no, I've had enough, goodbye?
Definitely. By the way, Don, we did interview, and it was, John and I talked about it earlier tonight. Don told the story of that photograph, and Don left photojournalism, and he started shooting flowers and landscapes. They're the most haunting, scary flowers and landscapes I've ever seen, you know? And he talks about the images that are in his filing cabinets, and he said at night they come, the spirit of the images like come down the hallways and essentially haunt him. I would like to think that Don, if he were shooting now, would have got more help along the way. You know, I think that is maybe a little bit of a difference, that in the old days you had to be macho and nobody knew how tormented or in pain you were. I don't think Dan would have remained forever as a journalist. I think he was interested in film and storytelling of a different kind. So I think that was part of his journey, but I don't necessarily think he would have been as courageous as you all who've really stuck with it.
Anyone else? Mark.
I've got to add one more thing here, that, and that is to pay tribute to Kathy, actually, because it was her relentless energy and determination and creativity which did keep us all focused after 1993 on what we were going to do. And you can see that the tragedy of Dan was he was such a creative young man, and everybody could see that who'd just been cut down. But the way Kathy was determined to get something good out of it, sure, we were all starting to think the same thing, but Kathy's energy and creativity saying, we've got to commemorate this, we've got to do this, we've got to write about it, we've got to get a film going. It went on year after year after year. And I think that energy helped keep the focus, and it helped keep the dialogue going on the same subject. So I do think you deserve a hell of a lot of credit for what the news organizations have done.
We were a team. You couldn't have done it. You did it. Thank you.
And finally, there is a film to be made.
Yes.
You have been trying to get this film made for some time.
Only 20 years. It took me 16 years to get the book done. That's, you know, that was a mere dawdle compared to the film. I like to think, I believe we've got the money in place. I'm talking about it. I think we'll be shooting in March in South Africa. I've been here before, over and over again. We have a great young actor named Douglas Booth who's going to play Dan. And we're, please God, going to be able to go out for offers with talent, unless something horrible happens, you know. But it's okay, you know. The time is right. It's not a movie, it's a movement. We want Oscars for the movie, but it's about a movement. It's about activating these souls to be able to take on the responsibility of this shift that I feel is happening in the world. So you all, the journalists here, you're so important as a vehicle of expression about all of this. I don't mean about our film, but about what's happening in the world. Seek the stories that are truth and inspiration along with the hard stuff and the dark stuff, but look for those stories that do inspire people to be greater, better, you know, more human in the best possible way of being human. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
Yes, I just briefly wanted to say that I knew Dan very briefly in Kenya, and I was at a very low point in my life. I think it was a relationship trouble. And he was the most extraordinary, compassionate, wise. He was younger he must have been about 5 years younger than me, and he had this deep compassion about him and this wisdom beyond his years. He really was the legend of the good die young. But it's been so amazing watching how that spirit of his and that and he was funny too, by the way, really funny, how that creative spirit is growing and spreading and, as you say, creating this movement. And it's fantastic. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Nikki's just finished a beautiful book called The Ancestral Continuum, which is about spirits continuing.
Yes,
it is,
exactly.
Well, I think that's a wonderful testimony to bring this to an end. And really, do read the book, because we have just raced over the story of Kathy's life. and I think you've gotten snippets of it, but it's a really remarkable story. And I said to her, I said, look, I started this book out of loyalty and because I knew you, but I was turning those pages wanting to find out what was happening in your life, and you've written it beautifully. And thank you so much for coming here tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John.
And now drinks.